So this evening, our topic that is being presented by Jenna-Lee is informed consent in people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, capacity building and assisted decision making. And I think, like, as we've all shared, we're quite interested in hearing how Jenna-Lee is going to carry us through this very interesting area of the work that we do in gender affirming healthcare. Jenna-Lee is a clinical psychologist and a researcher based in Cape Town. They use they and them pronouns. They run an LGBTQIA+ exclusive private practice. They have worked in the public sector, in the Department of Health, in the field of intellectual and developmental disabilities. Jenna-Lee is also a contributor in a section on the HIV and the South African HIV Clinicians Society Gender Affirming Healthcare Guidelines for South Africa. And they worked on the informed consent and intellectual developmental chapter. They're currently doing research on the intersubjectivity of transitioning genders and suicide risk. And they've had an opportunity to present a paper titled Between a Cock and a Hard Place for healthcare providers' experiences in providing gender affirming healthcare in South Africa on the year 2022 in WPATH Symposium. I see some of us have already started uploading our HPCSA registrations. Can I ask that we all do that now in our chat box, and we will do that again towards the end of the talk this evening. Jenna-Lee, over to you.
Hi. It was great actually hearing you just read the name of that article. I had to have a little chuckle. I'm going to go straight into the PowerPoint. Just give me a second. Has it opened the...
I can't see it yet. Yes, okay, we can see it now.
It now?
Yeah, we can see it now.
Okay, cool. All right. Yeah, so I'll be talking about gender affirming healthcare and with people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. I'm first going to go through, just to kind of like orient everybody to some of the definitions and concepts around intellectual and developmental disabilities. And then before getting into the actual like so-called clinical work I'm going to be also just talking about some of the misconceptions around people with intellectual disabilities, some of the models of disability, and how this relates to barriers to accessing care. Then from there, we'll go into the informed consent, assessing capacity, and how to actually assist clients with intellectual disability or ID to access healthcare. So one of your resources is in Cape Town is the Western Cape Forum for Intellectual Disability. So I've actually just put their pamphlet up here, and their website address is on the next slide. So they're a good organization to reach out to if you do need to, if you are working with people with ID. So just to start, so the definition of ID is that it's an umbrella term for a wide range of difficulties which impact on a person's intellectual and adaptive functioning. So previously, there was more of a focus on IQ in terms of intelligence, but there's been a good shift around this, where we're now also looking at adaptive functioning. So in other words, their ability to complete daily tasks and to learn things. And one of the key things is that this is the onset is during a developmental period, but it's a group of lifelong conditions. So it can include, so sometimes like some people with Down syndrome, autism is also included, but I just wanted to say up front here that I'm not going to be talking about autism specifically, even although it does fall under this umbrella term, especially in terms of the developmental aspect, because what I am going to focus on is for people whose like intellectual and their adaptive functioning falls more within the intellectual disability range, which I'll get to just now, because like a lot of people with autism do not have intellectual disability. So I just wanted to make that distinction. Just going back to the Western Cape Forum for ID, I highly recommend that book, that handbook, the Understanding Intellectual Disability. It's very accessible. It covers like a wide array of topics. They also have plenty of other resources, which, yeah, I'd suggest actually going and like having a look at their website. So when we talk about ID, we look at like the different levels of intellectual disability. So we've got mild, moderate, severe, and profound. So the majority of people with intellectual disability have mild ID. This percentage isn't going to add up to 100, but you're looking at between like 70 to 85% of people with ID have mild ID. Around 25 to 30 have moderate, probably about 5 to 10% severe, and less than 2% of people with ID have profound ID. People with profound ID usually have like a whole lot of physical disabilities and other things that go along with it. And yeah, unfortunately tend to have a shorter lifespan. So when it comes to gender affirming healthcare, because of capacity and capacity to consent, which we'll come back to, the majority of the people who you would be working with would have mild ID, and some might have moderate ID. Yeah, so in terms of the adaptive functioning is that it goes across 3 different domains. So the one is about the social domain and social skills. The other one is communication, and then the other one is daily living. So for most people, they sort of like their intellectual capacity is on par with their adaptive functioning. So when we assess ID and we kind of like figure out at what level of intellectual disability the person is, we use a whole range of different assessments. So we don't use just an IQ test, but we definitely use an IQ test. And then we also use the Vinelands, which assesses the adaptive functioning. And the Vinelands also gives you like an IQ score kind of equivalent. And what you usually find is that for the person is that there's kind of like I guess you could kind of call it like a flat profile. So the conceptual or the intellectual domain ends up being the same, like on an equal level as the adaptive functioning. But that isn't always the case, because one of the big things is also just about opportunity. So, for example, you might have somebody who has, developed like good communication skills. Their verbal abilities are like well developed, but they maybe haven't had the opportunity to engage in daily living activities. So maybe they're not allowed to make their own tea, or their bed gets made up for them. And I know this sounds a bit ridiculous, but when it comes to institutions where unfortunately a lot of people with ID are, so they're not necessarily just the big hospitals, but even some of the smaller, what's referred to as like group homes, but it's like assisted living, like residences, that those are also quite institutionalized. And we'll get back to that. We'll get to that in the next few slides when we start talking about some of the misconceptions around intellectual disability. So yeah, there's generally kind of like a sort of like a global functioning sort of profile. But you might have somebody whose verbal abilities are really well developed, and they're expressive verbal abilities, and so they're able to communicate quite clearly. but that doesn't necessarily mean that their receptive communication abilities or their understanding of what people might be saying is the same. So one of my favorite authors, Valerie Sinison, she wrote a book called The Secondary Handicap. And she was talking about how we sometimes either overestimate or underestimate a person with ID's capacity. So we might think that because their verbal abilities are well developed, that they will be able to do all the other tasks that's often expected of them, which is unfortunate because it does kind of like set them up for failure. And so even though there's like a lot of issues around IQ tests, they are really, really helpful to actually determine the person's sort of strengths and opportunities and some of the things where they have more support needs in. So yeah, so on that is there's this awful term about that you'll hear a lot in the field is high functioning and low functioning. And we're really trying to move away from that because there's just so much like stigma attached to it. And instead, how we think about it is it's in terms of a person's support needs. So the so-called high functioning people are going to have lower support needs, and the so-called lower functioning people have higher support needs. And it's a really important sort of perspective to adopt because it tells us that it's the environment, it's the caregivers, it's our responsibility to actually meet the person with ID where they're at and to provide them with the support that they need to be able to function in a society that generally excludes them. And this will come back to when we talk about informed consent, because the informed consent process when it comes to people with ID it's about how much support they need in order to prove to you that they have the capacity. Yeah, so just some stats. There isn't a lot of research. These are 2 studies that I managed to find. There aren't any studies done in South Africa, so unfortunately I can't give any kind of in terms of prevalence rates for us. Yeah, just going back is that with people with ID, about 30 to 50% of them have autism. 30% tend to have epilepsy. So there's a lot of like other co-occurring disorders and just conditions that also need to be considered when it does come to gender affirming healthcare as well. So in terms of like stats, like prevalence rates of people with ID, is that yeah, the problem is that the in these various studies, the prevalence studies, is that the definition of intellectual disability is often changes. So we can't necessarily use that. In the UK, they tend to refer more to learning disabilities. And then most of the research is unfortunately done in the global north. So they estimate that it's between 1 to 3% of the human population has intellectual disability. There are some studies done by, I guess, our colleagues in the global north saying that in low income countries that it's up to 16%. But I think we can be quite critical in terms of how we interpret that. In South Africa, it's estimated again to be between like 1.5 to 3%. But they have some studies have shown that in the Western Cape, it's actually a lot higher, that it's closer to 5% of the population. Various theories as to why that is. One of the big considerations is the historical DOP system, and yeah, just fetal alcohol spectrum disorder and how that is often connected to intellectual disability. So yeah, just I think it is really important for us to talk about some of the misconceptions of people with ID. I'll come back to this picture, but it is kind of it demonstrates as a reflection of what people have in mind sometimes when they think about somebody with ID, and all these kind of ideas that go with it, that they're incapable of learning, that they sometimes stunted. I mean, we had the terms that we used before, which was retarded, and yeah, and it's important that we've changed that way of thinking about it, because they obviously they can learn, and as they grow and develop like the rest of us, they learn, and they're able to kind of like engage in life and society, and aren't somehow like stunted. They're not all the same. It's sometimes, even when I'm kind of like writing and actually saying these things, that it seems a bit silly, but there are these misconceptions that people kind of think and treat them as a homogenous group. They can make decisions for themselves. We'll talk about how they sometimes will need assistance in making some of those decisions, but they definitely have the capacity to do so. Yeah, then there's the sort of very dark kind of way of looking at people with ID, and they've been even referred to as useless eaters, kind of being considered as being a burden on society, and this idea that they don't give back. I think one of the really important things is that people with intellectual disability have very rich inner lives, and they are capable of very like loving, intimate, and complex relationships. Then why it's also important, I think, for the topic tonight is that they also have complex like relationships and understandings and experiences of their gender. So my dog is in the background. Let me just get them.
Okay, Jenna.
Okay, I'm back. Yeah,
Thank you.
so there've been a couple of sort of systematic reviews that have been done on gender identity and intellectual disability, and one of the articles said that people with intellectual disability have just as much of a diverse and complex experience of their gender, but it's expressed differently and it's communicated differently. And I think that is just really important to keep in mind, because it means that for a lot of people with ID who are trans and gender diverse, that they do need gender affirming healthcare. And yeah, I think it was a couple of years ago, but one of my colleagues referred somebody to me with ID, and they kind of held quite a very like psychoanalytical perspective of it, and they thought that because this person with ID that they were presenting as trans, they weren't sure, that it was some sort of like developmental delay in terms of their gender development, which is hella problematic. So yeah, leading on from the misconceptions is that those misconceptions inform tropes, or the stereotypes that are often like oversimplified representations of people or a group of people. So I'm going to be sharing some of these tropes with you. My partner did her master's on the representation of people with intellectual disability in the media. So I'm actually going to take that's straight out of her thesis, and just explaining some of these tropes that are out there about people with intellectual disability. So the first one is the heroes. and it's a common trope we see throughout various representations of stories of people with disabilities and people with intellectual disabilities. It is one of the disabled as bravely striving towards quality of life that is less disabled or more normal. In these cases, the subjects are lauded for attaining some form of normality or for overcoming massive adversity. In these representations, sorry?
I'm on mute.
The disabled subject is often framed by notions of humility, bravery, determination, and the triumph of human will. There are exceptions which are meant to inspire others faced by adversity, as well as inspire gratitude in the non-disabled viewer for their able body and neurotypical mind. It's important to note here that the disabled hero is not the same as the non-disabled hero or the neurotypical hero, who may use their willpower and talents to save others. The trope of the heroes is most notably seen in what is sometimes termed inspiration porn, which is the representation of disability as a form of disadvantage that can be overcome for the titillation of other people or observers. In this trope, the disabled subject is objectified, devalued, and mystified. The next one is the freaks and demons. So this leads us well into the next common trope found in representations of people with ID, infrequent and demonization. Like the hero trope, it also objectifies and mystifies its subject, but not to inspire and put them on a pedestal, but rather to tantalize, thrill, or fetishize. Then we have the metaphors. So the trope of disability as a metaphor or symbols for society's greater existential concerns can be traced through the literature and art. Tom Shakespeare, he comes from the school of thought of more about like the cultural models of disability, which we'll also talk about in a bit. So he argues that disability is the most active and prominent metaphor of all, and that disabled people become the ciphers for aspects of life which non-disabled people cannot deal with or process. Essentially, disability becomes a shorthand for a non-disabled society's fears of frailty and mortality. In literature, an impairment is often a metaphor for a deeper character flaw or a greater social truth. A missing limb could be a symbol of loss. In Tom Foster's How to Read Literature Like a Professor, Foster claims that if a blind character is introduced into a story, the writer must include certain accommodations for the character. For example, each other character must notice the disability and so behave differently. These accommodations, or minor constellation of difficulties, he goes on to say, means that something important must be at stake. A disabled character cannot be in a story unless it's for a reason, and that reason is not simply because they are worthy and interesting characters. They must be a symbol which drives the stories of other characters. And then we have the pitied. So Rosemary Garland Thompson refers to the trope of the pitied as the sentimental narrative of disability, where people with disabilities are occasions for narcissistic pity or catalysts for life lessons for the non-disabled viewers. A great example of the trope of people with disabilities as pitiful is the media produced to drum up support for charities. These demeaning images are another form of fetishism and objectification. Here, pity from the viewers is encouraged and commodified. As Shakespeare puts it, pity is an expression of superiority. It can also be the obverse and hatred and aggression. This imagery can be compared to imagery of people in the Global South for charity campaigns, and it could be argued that the same processes of colonization and imperialism are involved in both instances. A pitied person with disabilities is seen as passive, dependent, incapable of making decisions or taking actions for their own. Then we have the children. The prevalence of children with disabilities as subjects in the media about disability has its legacy partly in telethons. This has been widely covered in disability studies by various academics who have explored how these charity spectacles were carefully crafted to tug on the heartstrings of viewers. children were selected and presented to fulfill the image of innocent angels. In general, the media tends to cover children with disabilities as subjects in their work. Infantilization occurs partly because of the low visibility of adults with intellectual disabilities. And so what happens there is that the adults with intellectual disabilities are also infantilized. I'm going to go back a slide. So this is a very famous, well-known photograph by a photographer called Roger Ballin. And it's of two brothers. I think it's Dressy and Cassie. And we can see here in the way that he photographed them that he was definitely going for the demons, the freak show that was supposed to evoke fear. What this photograph inspired is the following image, which is a picture taken out of a video game. And these are these monsters in the video game that you're supposed to fight, and they're supposed to be scary. But somebody else came along a couple of decades later and took a photograph of the same two brothers, Herman Verwijn. And here you can see that it just captured something that's just so rich and complex. The expressions on their faces, you can see that they have like a good relationship between the two of them. It's completely different. And so we have the same two people, but from different perspectives. And that's what really matters. That is why we have to carefully consider these tropes and these misconceptions that we have of people with ID. So where do these come from? So there are various theorists that have proposed different models of understanding why people with disability are perceived in the way that they are and treated in the way that they are. So the most well-known one will be the medical model, which treats disability as an impairment that needs to be fixed. And what goes very closely with it is the charity model, because if people with intellectual disability are objects of pity and tragedy, then obviously they need to be fixed. And this is also to, I think, make people without disabilities feel better about themselves by, kind of like doing this individual acts of kindness towards people with disability, because they defended against it. Then we have the social model, which was in response to the medical model. And the social model says that disability isn't some innate impairment or deficiency, but it's rather a disablement by society and by environmental factors. So it focuses on removing barriers and creating a more inclusive society. And so it emphasizes social support, access to resources and services. And this is a rights-based model. And then we have the cultural model, which is also a constructivist model like the social model. They complement one another, where the argument here is more about how disability is a cultural phenomenon and it's shaped by cultural values and beliefs. So we can go back to some of those tropes. And yeah, so it's important for us to think about the cultural model, especially in our work, because we need to be sensitive to people from diverse cultural backgrounds, which includes people with disabilities. Then we have the rights-based model, and the rights-based model, the social model, they like strongly complemented one another, because the social model was advocating for there to be less barriers and to promote inclusion and accessibility. And so what naturally followed and kind of like went hand in hand was to change our laws and to change policies. And this is what the rights-based model is sort of founded on. Then more locally, we have Professor Judith Mackenzie, who's based at UCT, and she wrote an article proposing the possibility model, And so in this model, it focuses more on people's abilities and strengths and opportunities, and that those need to be sort of promoted, so that we do have a more positive and inclusive view of disability. What I want to just say here is that there are so many euphemisms around disability and people with intellectual disability. And sometimes you might hear the term of differently abled, which is, I think, again, it's like a way that we defend against disability, because what we're essentially saying is that there's something wrong with being disabled. And so we're trying to come up with all these kind of terms, and it's actually just based on, on biases, maybe not necessarily conscious, but it's rooted in ableism. Then we have the Ubuntu model, which looks at the interconnectedness of all human beings. So the focus is on community and social support, and it sees disability as a natural part of human diversity. Sorry. Yeah, so with the Ubuntu model, how it kind of looks at disability is that it says that it's disablement, not disability, it's disablement is as a result of viewing disability as inhuman and degrading, and therefore others' humanity and their own. So if people with disabilities are considered as less than, then that's a reflection on everybody else within the community as well. Then we have the feminist disability studies. So earlier on, I was also quoting some of Rosemary Garland Thompson. And this is sort of the framework that I tend to come from. And as a result, we even named the puppy, who was causing a bit of a nonsense just now, after her. So the puppy's called Thompson, in honor of Rosemary Garland Thompson. So she's a prolific writer. Highly recommend getting some of her books and reading more on it if you're interested in this. But she takes a more of a critical and an intersectional perspective of gender and disability. And one of her main focuses is to challenge ableism and sexism and how these are like interconnected with one another. There's one of my favorite articles that she wrote is about the misfits. And essentially how she defines the misfits is that it's a mismatch of being out of step with the norms and expectations, that there's some sort of like normate body that is the standard against which all other bodies are measured. And this creates a situation where individuals who deviate from the norm are seen as abnormal, deficient, or in need of repair. With that, and in this article, it's almost as though, kind of like how we've taken the term queer back, is that misfits becomes like it also becomes a political activity. Like it's part of it is actually about misfitting, and in a way like being quite intentional about it, that there's something about actually you don't necessarily want to fit in with a society that is so ableist. And then we have Eva Kate, and she's a moral philosopher. And I think this, again, is also very relevant. And I think there are a lot of parallels between her philosophy and the Ubuntu model. So Eva Kate, she's a philosopher, and her daughter has severe intellectual disability. And so through her relationship with her daughter, she kind of came up with the concepts of relationality and dependency when it comes to intellectual disability specifically. And so the emphasis is on the importance of recognizing the interdependence of individuals and the ways which relationships are essential to human flourishing. So there's this obsession with intelligence, as though intelligence is the holy grail. And we even have like, I think, therefore I am. It's as though what makes us human is our frontal lobe, is our intelligence. And what she's saying is that that's not true. What makes us human is our dependency on one another, is our relationships with each other. And that this dependency should be understood as a natural and necessary part of human existence, because we're all dependent on each other in different ways and in some points of our lives. So I just want to pause here for a second and just talk about the D word. So disability. The majority of clients who I've worked with over the years, they don't use intellectual disability and the term disability to describe themselves. Sort of at the beginning of my career, I'd like ask a client, how do they feel about their intellectual disability, or how do they think other people see it? And most of the time they'd look at me and be like, I don't know what you're talking about. But instead they can describe the things that they struggle with, and they'll definitely be able to actually tell you about how other people perceive some of those things that they struggle with. So they might say that, they have difficulties with school, or they have difficulties with reading. And so in our work with clients with ID is that it's rather to be descriptive, as opposed to using the terms like intellectual disability. And what I suggest is asking them how they refer to themselves, like how they refer to their disabilities, what terms that they use for it. Sometimes those terms might be problematic because of internalized ableism and those tropes that they have to live with and that get put on them all the time. And then also to ask their carers. So ask their caregivers about what terms that they use. Okay, so the informed consent model. It's the same principles apply. So the informed consent model that we use in gender affirming healthcare and in other healthcare, it's exactly the same. So it is about, ensuring that our clients and our patients have everything that they need to be able to make the decisions about their treatment. It is about promoting self-determination and autonomy. It's not just a once-off thing. It takes time. It is complex. It is quite dynamic. But for people with ID, there needs to be some changes. It needs to be done a little bit differently. And one of the key things is that the environment, and I say like the environment here, but it's also the therapeutic relationship between the healthcare provider and their client, that needs to be supportive and safe. And I think we take this for granted, and we can learn a lot from people with ID, and just in terms of how we treat neurotypical people as well. That I think so many of the principles that apply here with people with ID are just as relevant. So it's not necessarily about kind of like obtaining consent from somebody, but it's a facilitative process in helping the person to be able to make a decision. And so for people with ID, they might need different accommodations. And I'll go into some of those a bit more, but one of the big things is about communication and comprehension. And so it is about ensuring that they understand what their options are, and what they have the opportunity to ask, maybe what it is that they want to know more about. And just the thing that I've highlighted here is that it is to make choices really explicit. So for people with ID, they are so often not given the opportunity to actually make choices, to actually make decisions for themselves. Kind of referring early on to some of the sort of institutional settings, is it gets decided for them what they're going to eat, even what clothes they're going to wear. And so here in this setting, this is like an opportunity for us to actually give them the opportunity to make decisions. And one of the ways to do it, though, is not necessarily to ask an open-ended question of what it is that you want, but is rather to give them different options. And so, you might say, like, do you want X, or would you prefer Y? This is what's related to X. This is what's related to Y. And actually being able to kind of like do it in a more concrete and accessible way. So communication, this is the big thing. And the way that I've sort of come to think about it is that it's not actually about the person with ID's communication difficulties. Communication it's about connection. It's between the people who are communicating with one another. And so it goes both ways. And if we're not good at listening, and if we're not good at communicating, then that can be quite disabling towards the person with ID. So what I often do with clients with ID is that I try to use plain language. I avoid medical jargon, and I tend to repeat myself in different ways to that kind of can like help them, to understand. And when it seems like there is some sort of misunderstanding in this interaction, the way that I frame it is that it's me who's not actually communicating it properly, that I need to talk about it differently. And so I won't ask them if they understand. I'll ask them, am I making sense? That I need to make myself more clear. So here's a list of just some suggestions when it does come to communication. The first point is really, really, really important. So often I see the person with ID is sitting in the room and the doctor is talking to their carer about them in front of them and not actually talking to them. So that's really, really important. And it's so commonly done that in these moments where the person with ID is included and is talked to directly, the entire interaction changes, and it's as though in those moments that they feel seen, they feel recognized, and that is really, really important for us to do in our work. So using clear, straightforward, unambiguous language, using different formats of communication and communication aids. So you might want to use like visual aids, signing. For a lot of people with ID, the expressive verbal abilities are maybe not as well developed, but their signing is. So the use of like signing and interpreters, that can be really helpful, and involving somebody familiar with the person's communication methods, and that it's almost as though you can consider that person as also a communication aid or a social aid. One of the main sort of systems that's worked is that's used is the PECS, or the Picture Exchange Communication System. And that's essentially just a whole lot of little pictures, and it is like a system in itself, and it's expensive, all the little pictures and things that you have to buy. But what I've done is with the person with ID is that we choose pictures together. And usually it's actually taking a camera and photographing different things that they maybe want to talk about. And that's a really helpful thing of being able to communicate, and get ideas across. Sensory difficulties, it's really important to understand that and what adjustments need to be made. In the beginning of every meeting or session, as well as at the end, is just to make it very clear what the meeting is about. And at the end, to again kind of summarize and conclude the meeting, and also then to explain what is going to be the purpose of the next meeting or this process. yeah, it's important to do that in every session and in every interaction. So for the using concrete examples, I'm gonna give an example of a client of mine a couple of years ago. Not going to go too much into the sort of the backstory, but she had a tattoo that she got when she was in prison. It's a whole issue of why she ended up there. She really shouldn't have, but let me not get too distracted. And what kind of came out in therapy and what we managed to organize and do is I got a tattoo artist to come into the hospital and cover up her tattoo. And so it took weeks. It took weeks of showing what different options she has, what kind of tattoo that she would like. And she chose a flower. And so the tattoo artist kind of figured it out, and he did a cover up tattoo for her. And then after he done the sort of the black and kind of shading part of the tattoo, he asked her if she would like it to, if he would, if she wants him to add color, if she wants the flower to maybe be a color. And she was like, no, it's fine. What I don't, it's fine. I don't know what you actually mean by this, being color. And so what he did is he took some ink and he just rubbed it with his finger onto the flower. And then she had this visual imagery. She had this picture of what the tattoo would actually look like if it did have the color added. And that made her very excited, and she was very happy about it. And so at the end, she chose a red flower. I think it's also important for us that when we do talk, that we do speak slowly and in a way that is comfortable, for the person. I have said here that sometimes you maybe want to make the sessions longer. I kind of disagree with that, but those are some of the recommendations. I think that just if sessions are too long, it does become more difficult for the person with ID to focus for a longer period of time. So what I prefer to do is actually have shorter sessions, but more frequently. And that also means that there's time in between sessions for them to be able to reflect on some of the things that have been discussed in the session and have some questions and kind of come back to that. And then check in. As I said earlier on, keep asking them if you are making yourself clear enough. So an example of this is gender identity, gender expression, performance. These are all very abstract terms. And it's we kind of need to change our language here. And it does sometimes come across as quite binary, but it is to actually try and make these abstract, complex terms more concrete. And so here, what I would suggest is how asking the person how they feel about themselves, if they feel like a boy or a girl, both, neither, or something else. And that kind of explaining that what gender identity is that it's about who you are on the inside, and it may or may not be the same as what the doctor or nurse or parents thought you were when you were born. So rather than even using the kind of terms of what you were assigned at birth, is to be more descriptive. When we're doing informed consent, it's not just about assessing capacity and getting that consent from somebody, but it's really about wanting to actually understand your client better, and understand what their needs are, what their needs are going to be throughout the process, how they feel about themselves. And so this is just a list of questions that I think that can be helpful in just exploring gender and exploring your client and how they understand themselves and feel about themselves and their relationship, and how they experience the world around them and how they perceive other people to experience them. And yeah, so I think these are just some like helpful questions to actually just explore gender with them. And then capacity. So I'm going to read just what is in the HIV Society's the gender affirming healthcare guidelines. I'm going to read a bit out of that on capacity. So in the context of intellectual and developmental disabilities, it can be unhelpful to view capacity as an all or nothing, or a have or have not, but rather that it comes in varying degrees. So people with ID often have difficulties with working memory, self-motivation, inhibition, mental flexibility, and abstract thinking, amongst other things, which can deter their capacity to make an informed decision. The UK Mental Health Care Act, amongst other things, other acts, advises that it must always be assumed that the person has capacity unless it is proved otherwise, and that you must not assume incapacity simply because someone has made an unwise decision. A person with ID may not be able to completely make an independent or autonomous choice, but through a facilitative process, they can be assisted to come to a decision. Be transparent and explain to the person with ID that you are talking to them to confirm that they can consent. In other words, that you need to know if they can communicate their choice to you, that they have an understanding and appreciation of that choice and are able to rationalize or explain why they have made that choice. Simply put, they need to be able to tell you what their situation is, i.e., that they want to change something, what it is that they maybe want to change, and what they want to know more about changing that thing, what their options are and their possible outcomes, risks and benefits, and why they are choosing one thing over another. What I want to just add here that isn't in the guidelines is that when it comes to assessing capacity in this sense, is that you are going to want to prompt the person. And it doesn't mean that you're like that it's leading questions or you're leading them to something, but because of their difficulties with working memory, for example, is that and executive functioning, is that they're not necessarily going to remember everything. But if you give them a prompt, then they'll be able to actually answer you and say what it is that they want. And I think that it's really important to kind of just make those kind of accommodations. And it might, from the outside, it might look like you're kind of like leading the person on, or that, you're kind of like swaying them in a certain direction. But this is one of the accommodations that they need in order to communicate to you that they do have capacity and that they can make decisions and they do have preferences. So it is important to remember that capacity to consent is situational and can change over time and place. And this is true too for people with intellectual disabilities. Just because a client has ID, it does not mean that they do not have the capacity to learn and gain an understanding of gender affirming healthcare. And so it must be considered whether they will have capacity in the future. Empowering a person with accessible knowledge and understanding of gender identity and gender affirming healthcare, and given the time to learn, explore, and ask questions, the issue of consent should be revisited if there is a concern that they do not have capacity. Assisted or sometimes substitute decision-making comes into play after it has been determined that the person does not have capacity to consent, and that all practical steps to enable the person to make their own decision have been exhausted. Those who are responsible for the person's care and well-being or have been given the legal authority will make the decision on their behalf based on the best interest of the person with ID. The respect of their right to bodily and psychological integrity must be upheld. And this comes to person-centered planning, is that it is all about the person with ID. It's all about what it is that they want, what it is that they need. And that every situation has to be tailored to the client, and you have to have like more of an sort of individualized kind of care plan based on what that person needs. And so any decisions that are made around their healthcare, it has to be with that in the forefront, that they are the most important person. Having said that, because people with ID are dependent on others for care to some degree, is that part of assessing the capacity is also assessing the system's capacity. Again, we're wanting to consider the social, the cultural, the Ubuntu models, not just focusing on the medical model. Because sometimes the person with ID can tell you what they want, but the people who care for them maybe aren't okay with that, or maybe they don't understand it. And so when it comes to like actually helping somebody with ID, is that their bigger circle also needs to be given the opportunity to learn more about gender affirming healthcare and to learn what the options are and so on. And so it is a shared responsibility. It is between you as the healthcare provider and your client, but it's also about ensuring that the person with ID is going to have that assistance from the people who care for them, and then identifying what their carers are going to need in order for this person to be able to access and enjoy gender affirming healthcare. So we need to adapt this to our context. But Achieve Together, it's an organization in the UK, developed a transgender easy guide. And it's incredible. I can share links where you can get a copy to it. It's just a PDF. I've just taken here like a couple of pages that I've just taken screenshots of and stuck in this slide as well as in the next one. But it explains so many different things about gender, about being trans, about transitioning. And you have pictures throughout, and you'll see that the language is, it's straightforward, it's easier to understand. And also just commenting on these pictures is that they're different kind of like ideas about how pictures and how images should be used. So some of my colleagues suggest that you should actually have photos of things, because that is like more concrete or aligned with what it looks like in reality. But other times that people prefer these kind of like images because there isn't anything in the background that's distracting, like it is a lot more clear. But if you look at these pictures, you can see that they're not infantilizing, it's not patronizing, because that's one of the really important things when we talk about making accommodations and ensuring that our language and our communication is more accessible, is that we don't want to do it in a patronizing way. So yeah, just briefly, is that there's a real gap in South Africa's legislation that we, especially when it comes to adults with ID, is that we don't have what I guess would be, you could probably call it like a Vulnerable Adults Care Act. And so we draw on the other acts and laws that we do have available to us. And yeah, and there's, I mean, our constitution is like the best place to start, and it does, promote the right to access to healthcare for people with disabilities as well. But what I have found helpful over the years in my work is actually drawing on some of the laws and guidelines from the UK. So, I mean, I've just mentioned that transgender easy guide, and then there's also the NICE guidelines, and I can provide links to that. And they're incredibly helpful. So yeah, there's the website for the NICE guidelines. They have these, the guidelines are for healthcare professionals and carers, but they also have easy guides for people with disabilities themselves, and they cover a wide array of topics. So just to conclude, is I can imagine that there hasn't been like a big turnout tonight, and I think why that is that because the majority of us probably don't have clients who have intellectual disabilities, and the issue is, if we go back to some of those stats in the beginning, is that if we're looking at like 10 to 12% of people with ID are gender diverse in some way, they are out there and they do need our care, but it's our responsibility to provide an environment where people want to be. And yeah, and so I do hope that this talk tonight has kind of inspired or encouraged you to be more open to having people with ID as clients. It might mean that, like in your waiting room or in your office, you have some of these pictures on your wall. That some of the, some of the pages from that easy guide, that you have that up there. Maybe as a GP, you're seeing a client who's got ID and they're there for the flu. But if they see that picture on that wall, that might prompt them to actually start asking you about this. And so, yeah, I do think it is really important that we provide an environment, and that we let people with ID know that, we are out there for them. And then just lastly, I've got a website that's full of a whole lot of resources and information about people with intellectual disability, but it is password protected, because there are a lot of like journal articles and that kind of thing, and I usually only use it with students who already have access to those articles. So I'd be willing to share some of that, but then you're just going to need to email me for the password. And yeah, like as I said, I'll actually go and put that easy guide on the website too. But yeah, I think that's me.